You're listening to the Drive Forward podcast. We're cruising through the latest in transportation to inspire a better tomorrow.
Welcome to the 6th episode of the Drive Forward podcast. I'm your host, Emily Jankowski. Today, we're chatting with Guna, the American Society of Civil Engineers 2020 president. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, Guna. We're super excited to have you here. So let's go ahead and dive on in. Why don't you start off by telling me a little bit more about your role at the American Society of Engineers?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here, talking about my role with ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers. As you probably know, ASCE is the oldest engineering society in our country. It has memberships over 150,000 members now, spread around 177 countries around the globe. Even though it's the American Society of Civil Engineers, it's more of a global organization with a very large footprint. So I've done a number of things with ASCE, holding a number of positions, attending a lot of conferences and events, and then went through the ranks of the geographic units, served as the High Plains branch president in Texas, and when I moved to Utah, served as the leader for the geotechnical group, served as the Utah section president, then as a Region 8 governor, then as a Region 8 director, served on the ASCE board, and now have the unique privilege and honor of representing all the 150,000 plus members around the world as its president, currently for the year 2020.
Wow. That's quite impressive. It seems like you've seen quite a bit of the facets of that organization and served quite a few different roles there. Well, I know one of the challenges right now that ASCE has taken on is really peering into the future 50 years from now in an attempt to imagine and envision futuristic civil engineering concepts. And you've dubbed it as the Future World Vision Project, dividing efforts into 5 futuristic cities, including the floating, frozen, mega, off-planet, and rural cities. It appears you're beginning first with the floating city. And I've seen some images on your website which indicate structures in the water with reimagined energy concepts, including solar power and using microwave to bring that power from space back to Earth. Can you tell us a little bit about the Future World Vision Project and how you foresee it leading the way for civil engineers in the future?
This is one of the things, a lot of us have been thinking about in terms of what do we do to, make civil engineering exciting. I've been talking about this through my term as a president-elect and stuff through various institutions, like a great institution, talking to faculty and others and say, what do we need to do to attract the best and the brightest to our profession? ASCE has an advisory group called the Industry Leaders Council. And so when they were talking about what do we do to excite and make civil engineering very exciting, so this kind of was born out of that conversation under the leadership of Jerry Buckwalter. So came up with this concept of the Future World Vision. So we had contracted with Alex McDowell and Altman, Willandry and company to look at, what are the trends, what do we need to be looking at. And so they've done a lot of research and a lot of minds have been working trying to come up with this. And so they came up with a timeline of what we potentially could see, the evolution of how we as human beings will habitat on this planet and maybe even outside in terms of all the new things that are coming up. And this floating city is one of the concepts. So what we've said is over a period of time that we will see migration into different forms of communities that we would conglomerate into and live in the future. Well, in some of these coastal areas with climate change and the sea level rise, there are going to be situations where people who will float off into this ocean and live on water surfaces, and others would probably go to higher grounds to find shelters and live off of higher grounds. So that is the concept there for a floating city. So a lot of research has gone in terms of what would this be and so on. So we said, okay, what do we need to do as civil engineers to prepare our folks for the future that we envision. For instance, we said, okay, how do we change the curriculum now and be able to address these types of issues which we could be seeing? And some of these things are already happening. As I said, people are thinking, students are thinking. The next generation is already envisioning, floating off into an ocean and creating a community. And you mentioned about, energy. We talked about, how do we do waste management? You talked about solar and microwaves. And there is also some years ago, and one of the leaders, part of the ILC, was in charge of the naval fleet and at harnessing wave energy to energize some of the submarines and so on. So the technology is out there. So we're just trying to bring it together and show, what it could be in the future, but we're just exploring the possibilities. Civil engineers need to be prepared to be able to address some of the challenges. We can't be caught flat-footed. So that's the reason why ASCE has undertaken this project of Future World Vision, looking into the future.
Absolutely. I think you've hit a great point there, Guna, in saying that this is definitely something to excite the future generation of civil engineers and get them, turning those wheels in their head to start maybe rethinking some of those futuristic problems. Speaking of really exciting technology today, many civil engineers are tasked with re-envisioning mobility and getting our current infrastructure up to par to adapt to those changes, such as autonomous and connected vehicles. And your futuristic vision problem shares that civil engineers need to become masters of systems integration. I think that's a really great term. How do you see civil engineers rethinking our current infrastructure to steer us into the future of mobility? And what are those important things to consider along the way?
So I've always said, about mobility, and as we discussed earlier, in terms of, we talk about congestion, is more concrete and steel the solution? Probably not. We need to look at, as a society, to see what are the challenges, how it's best addressed, while we continue to preserve the resources and preserve this planet that we call home. So I think when we start to think, we need to think outside of the box. We need to not be forced into thinking the way we've been thinking in the past. And that's why we need to be more very creative. And I think that's what's going to excite our profession and excite the next generation, is you need to be able to think out of the box, come up with solutions, and try to figure out a way to implement these things. So it takes a lot of things to make this thing happen. It takes creative thinking, the innovation part of it. Then we need to talk about collaboration. And then how do we go about implementing it so that we can all be comfortable with the solutions that we are putting out there that's going to serve our current society as we see it now, and also probably into the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. How do you foresee projects like what we're trying to do here at Illinois Center for Transportation, which is to build a high-speed autonomous and connected vehicle track known as the Illinois Autonomous and Connected Track at the former Chanute Air Force Base in Rantoul, Illinois? How do you see university projects like these making a real-world impact and a difference for both the public and the next generation of civil engineers?
I mean, most of you are already doing it. You got these institutions that's the incubator for creative thinking. We need to open it up a little bit more. Make sure that we continue to keep thinking out of the box. So as I said before, you need to have that ability to freely think. And then the other thing that you're already doing is you're already collaborating with the industry. That's very essential to bring those two groups to meet and to explore some of these things of the future. And then you need the leadership and the commitment. And that's kind of one of the things that we're fighting right now, is how do we transition this from the incubator there with all these great ideas and stuff that's being tested and so on. And it takes some leadership and courage to be able to implement it in real life and then be able to, address those kinds of issues and take it. One of the things that I learned over the course of the time is, everybody talks about Einstein and the things that he helped us and opened our eyes to. But I'd heard that one of his biggest attributes was his ability to explain a very complex scientific theory in very simple terms. That's one of the things that I think we as engineers and those in these situations and opportunities should be able to put it in terms where the general public is able to understand and relate so that they, are able to buy into what you're proposing and help you implement these things so that it benefits everybody. But civil engineers need to provide the basic infrastructure wherein the technologies can be deployed and safely used. Because the ultimate, vision and mission of ASCE is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the general public.
It sounds like a great vision for the future. And speaking of visions, what kind of a legacy do you hope to leave during your time as president of the American Society of Engineers?
It's very humbling for the opportunity that I've had, but I think the word legacy is a very big word, but the duration is a very short duration. One of the things that I came and promised folks as one of my top 10 vision statements, the top one is to make this organization more transparent, make it more diverse, make it inclusive, nimble, and sustainable for the foreseeable future so that it continues to serve our members because it's an organization of individual members and to serve the profession. So I'm just doing a very little part, with the support of a lot of folks. And I hope when people look back at this time, they will not only look at me as a COVID president who canceled a lot of events and made everything, but I look at it as an opportunity, to go virtual and also be able to reach more people and to communicate with them, share with them, and for them to communicate with me and the board, share with us their views of what they would like for this organization to be in the future. So it's been a fun opportunity, and I consider it to be a privilege and an honor. And I always close my remarks by saying, I'm passionate about this profession. I'm very optimistic about the future, and I'm very proud to call myself a civil engineer.
Wonderful. Well, Guna, it certainly sounds like you've set a great precedent for future presidents of this organization, and we really appreciate your willingness to chat with us today. That's all I had, and thank you again for joining us on the Drive Forward podcast, and listeners, thank you so much for staying tuned in.
The Drive Forward podcast is a production of Illinois Center for Transportation, a research center of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We invite you to subscribe to the Drive Forward podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. And while you're there, feel free to like or rate us. Thanks for listening. Keep the conversation rolling by using the hashtag Drive Forward.